Hello, and how are you feeling? Welcome to Series 3, Episode 4 of Coaching from Not a Blue Tree with me, Gary Burns. This episode is all about the NLP Model of Communication. So, the NLP Model of Communication shows us how we process and store information. How that stored information, our memories, may not be what we think it is, and what this means for our understanding of the world and how we communicate with others. The NLP model of communication is a really important model. And the reason that it's so important is I think many of us believe that our memories are an accurate reflection of what happened. Almost as if we have in some way filmed and recorded what happened and kept a true copy in our memories. And it's only when we have shared experiences and we start talking about those shared experiences and realize that other people have remembered things in a very different way or have remembered different aspects that we start to question our own recollection of what happened. And the NLP model of communication explains how that happens, how we end up with different recollections, how we end up with a different perspective on key points of what happened. And of course, by understanding that, it then gives us the realization, the understanding that other people are doing exactly the same thing as well. So we're all walking around with our unique take on what's gone on to and around us. And once we understand that, that allows us to interact with others in a very different way. Let's start by looking at the model. The model starts with us experiencing the world around us. So let's start with the model itself. So we experience the world through our 5 senses: what we see, hear, feel, taste, and smell. And that sensory information is coming in all of the time. Huge volumes of data that we simply have no way of processing. Our brain, with all of its power, simply cannot cope. And if we tried to think about all of that information consciously, we would just be overloaded. So, as that information is coming in, a whole series of processes happen. And we run all of that data, all of that information through a series of filters. We delete, we distort, we generalize. We run that information through filters around time and space, matter and energy, through language, memories, decisions. We also have filters around metaprograms, beliefs, values, and attitudes. But what does that mean in practice? This is the important thing. So let's start with those filters: delete, distort, and generalize. So first of all, simply because of the huge volume of data that's coming in, we have to get rid of stuff that's just not relevant. So our unconscious mind just gets rid of all the minuscule details, all the stuff that doesn't really add anything to the general sense of what's going on around us. And just think about it for a moment. Think about walking down the street and the volume of data that is there. There'll be the obvious things, the buildings, the pavements, the roads, but then there'll be the shading of the buildings, cracks in brickwork, loose paving stones on the pavement, faded white lines in the street. The level of detail, if we really wanted to explore it, is immense. So we spend an awful lot of time just getting rid of that. And then we distort stuff. So we process stuff in line with our own values and beliefs and everything about us. We distort it to fit our model of the world. And of course, we do a lot of generalizing because that saves us time. We don't have to process and understand every door. We have a general sense of what doors do. We know that they open and close. And as we go through life, we learn that those mechanisms can be slightly different. And generally, we read that very well. But we do that across everything. We make these huge generalizations because, again, that saves processing power, it saves time. And then there are the additional filters. So first of all, the filters around time, space, matter, and energy. And these I always think are really interesting ones because they all sound a bit sort of out there, a bit esoteric almost. But the reality is what this is looking at is that our perception and our memories will be based on how we have a sense of time passing, of where we are in generally in time in our lives, and all that's going around us. And the filters around matter and energy, our experience of the world will change depending on whether we're feeling very energetic, whether we're feeling a bit lethargic, whether our energy levels are high, whether our energy levels are low. And time and space is a really interesting one because when time is passing slowly, when we're feeling very bored, our sense of events around us is very different from when we're very active and doing things and time passes very quickly. And the other thing to remember is that changes with age. They say that as you get older, time seems to pass more quickly. The reality is time is a constant, except lots of very clever scientific people will tell you quite the opposite. But time is a constant in the sense of there are 60 minutes in every hour, 24 hours in every day, 365 days in 3 years out of 4. So we don't get through that time any quicker or any slower. But with each year it passes, 1 year is a smaller percentage of our entire life, so it gives us a very different perspective. And then we filter things through language, and language is about our understanding of words and what words mean. Because we all at times believe that we're speaking the same language, and yet there are lots of words which we understand differently. And the meaning we give to those words can also change. An interesting example of this is the word success. What does success mean to you? For some people, it's about money and possessions. For other people, it's about career progression. For others, it's about becoming an expert in any given field. And it's interesting how we assume that success, how we see it, is what everyone sees. And then one day we discover that that's not the case. And that's all about the language that we use. We also run our experiences through our own memories. What have we experienced before? How does this correlate to what's happening now? Is it a similar experience? Is it experience where I've had a bad outcome in the past and therefore I'm more wary now? Do I start to rate things based on those previous experiences? And it's one of the reasons it's part of the way that limiting decisions are formed, because we have a bad experience once, we become a bit wary the second time round, and then that filter kind of becomes installed, and then we see everything through that filter and shy away from those bad experiences. And in a similar way, our filters around previous decisions. Have we made good decisions in the past? Have we made decisions which we've later regretted? One of the other filters, which I'm not going to go into huge detail because it will be the subject of a future podcast, is our meta programs. And that looks at a very deep-seated way of how we see and experience the world and what really matters to us. And in many ways, meta programs sit at an identity level. Values sort of sit one level above in many ways, but meta programs sit below. And then, of course, we have filters around our beliefs, our values, and our attitudes. So very simply, if we believe something is good, we will filter it in one way. If we believe it is bad or wrong, we will filter it in a different way. If in our hierarchy of values we see things as important to us, we will filter it in one way, whereas if it's in the values hierarchy, it's not that important, then we will see it in a very different way. And again, I'll be talking about values in a future podcast. But what all those filters are doing is shaping that sensory information to give us our internal representation of what happened. So that gives us our memory, our version of what happened. And it is our version because we've done some deleting, we've done some distorting, we've done some generalizing. We've run it through our filters around time, space, matter, and energy, of language, memories, decisions, and so on. And those filters are unique to us. They are the sum of our past experiences, of what we've learned, of what matters to us, shaped by our good experiences and our bad experiences, shaped by previous decisions that we've made, possibly even shaped by decisions that we've decided not to make. The reality is, though, we end up with our internal representation. And it would be lovely to think that once you have that internal representation, that at least becomes fixed in some way. And yet that's not the case. Because first of all, our state, our emotional state in any given moment will impact and affect how we see those memories. And if you're not sure about this, just think about this for a moment. So on the days when you're feeling in a low mood, not very energetic, you just want to lounge around, not do anything, it can be quite hard to access all those positive memories, all those good experiences. And similarly, on the days when we're feeling really upbeat, really positive, really ready to get out there and conquer the world, it can be very difficult to access those negative memories. And again, think about it. In those moments when you're feeling really energized, really ready to do lots of stuff, and someone comes along all doom and gloom, it's kind of, no, I'm not having that today. You're not raining on my parade. Because we just don't want to entertain that. Because our state in that moment is so positive. But that shapes how we access our memories, how we access those internal representations, and how we perceive them. And that in turn affects our physiology. It affects what we do with our bodies, both the amount of energy we've got to move ourselves, but also how we hold ourselves, how we project to the outside world. And again, just think how difficult it is when you're in one of those days when everything feels like it's going wrong, to actually get up and put yourself out there to give that aura of confidence, if you like. And so those three things, our internal representation, our state, and our physiology, are all operating on a two-way street, and how we access those internal representations. And it's why on those bad days, we can very quickly access all the other things that have gone wrong in our life. And similarly, on those good days, it's why it's very quick to think of other examples where we have done well and things have turned out as we wanted. And that all of that then affects our behavior. It has a very direct impact on what we do or what we don't do and how we go about it. So that's how the communication model works. So in summary, we're experiencing the world through our five senses. As all that information comes in, on an unconscious level, we're running it through a whole string of filters based on our beliefs, our values, past experiences, what matters to us, and creating an internal representation. That internal representation is what makes up our memories. It is not, though, a fixed version of what happened. With the passing of time, as we get more experience, we might view those things very differently, and our internal representation shifts. And if you're not sure about that one, think about things that excited you as a 4-year-old, and think about how you feel about those things now. As a 4-year-old, you would have been very, very excited. As adult you are now, you may see those things very differently. The reality is, in that moment, the excitement was real. But our internal representation with the passing of time has changed because different things matter to us. And that internal representation is only part of the process. That internal representation is affected by our physiology and our state. And similarly, our state and our physiology affect those internal representations. It is, as I said before, very much a two-way street. And all of that then affects our behaviour. So how do we use this on a practical level? So I'm struck by a number of things with this model. The most important thing for me is it reminds me that what I believe is a true experience of what happened at any point in my past, I now understand that that's simply an internal representation. I have created that through all the filters that I have equally created over the years. And those filters have been formed by my experiences, by what I've learned, by the things that have worked out for me and the things that haven't. Those filters make all the difference. And I equally understand that depending on how I'm feeling in any given moment, how I'm feeling physically in any given moment, will impact which memories I access and how I view those memories when I access them. So I'm now quite comfortable with the notion that those internal representations are not fixed and actually may be a very poor reflection of what actually happened in any given moment. And that's a really useful point to remember. And the critical thing for me is that this is about communication. This is, after all, a communication model. So, if I find myself questioning and turning things over in my mind a little bit too much, I get a bit stuck. The model reminds me that I may be fixating on something that didn't really happen. I may be fixating on something that my internal representation has created. So I could be spending an awful lot of energy on something that isn't real. And that's quite a wake-up call. But what it forces me to do, and I'm really glad that it forces me to do it, is to reconsider what I feel about the event. And what if I choose to reframe that event in a way which is much more helpful for me? So, I don't know, if something happens at work where at the end of the day I feel really annoyed because of what has happened, I can stay with that memory of, oh, this was really annoying, and I can turn that over and I can fixate on that. What I do now, though, is if I find myself doing that, and trust me, there are days when there's stuff that does my head in, quite frankly, I stop for a moment and question, actually, how helpful is it fixating on that internal representation? So what can I do? What can I take from that is much more helpful to me? And then, of course, I get some learnings. And then, of course, I think, well, if I find myself in this situation in the future, this is what I'm going to do differently so I don't end up feeling quite so annoyed. So it's really helpful on that front. The biggest help, though, is with communicating with others. If your starting point is understanding that we may not have a shared internal representation of what's going on, it gives us a head start. Because there may be previous conversation about a way to achieve something. And then when we get down to doing it, we may have very different perspectives on how we're going to go about that. And what I've found is, because I understand this model, I'm now the one who, when it feels like we're working or talking at cross purposes, I'm the one who says, hang on a minute. We seem to be working at cross purposes here. This is my understanding of the task, and I will share what my understanding is. So that's my internal representation. And then I will say to the other person, what's your understanding? And sometimes I will say, well, pretty much what you're saying except for this. Or they'll say, oh, no, that's not what I was understanding at all. And then they will share their representation. And that then immediately brings into the open where the conflict is. And at that point, we need to decide, because we both now shared what our internal representation is, we both now need to decide, actually, what are we going to do now? How are we going to make this happen? And I am astonished, genuinely astonished, of how often that can happen. Sometimes on a really minor detail, something on really quite significant and quite major. And previously I would have thought, how is it possible that we were in the same room having the same experience and we end up with very different outcomes and very different understanding? But now I know. And I know it's because I have a set of filters, they have a set of filters, and we may process and experience the world in very different ways, leading us to very different internal representations. But because I now have this knowledge, this understanding of the model, I can take that first step. Because I know that when there is that conflict, whether it's internal conflict with my own thoughts or external conflict where there's differing opinions, that will come down to internal representations. And also how people are feeling, people's physiology, of course, but it tends to be that internal representation. This is how I've understood the situation, and that's where we're in different places. And of course, as soon as you bring that out into the open, you now do have a shared experience of, if nothing more, we've got different understandings here. And what's really curious about that, sometimes it can be me who's saying, oh, I can see where I misunderstood things there. And sometimes it can be the other person. And sometimes it's, we need to go back to go back to others. We need to go back to look at the task, the original task as it was set. Why are we in very different places here? But what it does, it takes away that tension and what can be really quite hefty friction at times, when it really does feel like you're speaking different languages and no one seems to know why. Once you get your head around this model, you really do know why. And that's a really powerful piece of knowledge and a really powerful way of making change happen when it really matters. So just think about this for a minute. Just think about what that means for you and your life and how you see the world and how you interact with others. Just imagine what life will be like when you've got your head around this completely and you understand that all of your memories, everything that you remember, everything that you imagine is simply an internal representation. It is not necessarily a true reflection of what's gone on around us. And as soon as you get your head around this, you will think back to all the times when there was miscommunication, when there was confusion, where there was conflict, and suddenly it all makes sense. The trick now is to make sure you get your head around this model. Understand how you're experiencing the world through your 5 senses. Understand how you're running all of that sensory information through your filters. Understand how you do that is unique to you. And then remember that this is creating an internal representation, which is your version of events, and it is a version which is not fixed, because that version will change with time. It will change depending on your state, on what your emotions are doing in any given moment. It will be influenced by your physiology, and your physiology will influence your emotions will influence your physiology, and your physiology will influence that internal representation just as your emotions will. So your internal representation is in a state of flux, and that's really powerful. And of course, it then does affect behavior. And of course, when you know that, if you find that your behavior is not going in the direction that you want it to go, then you can go back to your internal representations. You can go back to your state and you can go back to your physiology and think what's happening or what's not happening here. And you can make effective changes. Now is the time to take action. Learn and understand the model. Make sure you have it at the forefront of your mind every time. Crucially, whenever it feels like communication is just not happening, whether that's communication internally or whether that's communication with others, bring yourself back to this model, because this model gives you the answers. How's that for a thought?